The blood wouldn't stop. Sage pressed her palm harder against the wound in her side, feeling the warm pulse of it seeping through her fingers, staining the rough, homespun fabric of her servant's dress a deeper shade of crimson with each labored step. The snow beneath her bare feet had long since stopped registering as cold. Her body had moved past shivering into something more dangerous, a spreading numbness that whispered of surrender. But she couldn't stop. Not yet. Not when she could still feel the flutter of life beneath her other hand, the tiny heartbeat that persisted against all odds, the child that had already survived so much. 3 moons she'd carried this secret. 3 moons of hiding the subtle swell beneath shapeless dresses, of swallowing the morning sickness with bitter herbs, of lying awake at night with her hands curved protectively over the life growing inside her. Tobias's child. Sweet, gentle Tobias, who had looked at her like she was something precious when everyone else saw only a servant to be used and discarded. Tobias, who had died with her name on his lips, his Omega blood staining the courtyard stones, because Eric had discovered their love and decided that an Omega touching his sister, even a sister he refused to acknowledge, was an insult that demanded death. Though even then, some part of her had wondered if the fury was too large for the offense, if Tobias had seen or heard something that made his silence more important than his sin. She hadn't even been allowed to mourn him. The memory clawed at her chest, sharper than the wound in her side. Eric's sword flashing in the torchlight. Tobias's body crumpling, the spray of blood that had caught her across the face like a brand. She'd screamed. She remembered screaming, though the sound had felt like it came from somewhere outside herself, some wounded animal she didn't recognize. And Eric had looked at her with those cold gray eyes, their father's eyes, the eyes she'd inherited too, and said, "Clean this up. And be grateful I don't tell father you were spreading your legs for Omega trash." She had cleaned it up, had scrubbed Tobias's blood from the stones on her hands and knees while the other servants pretended not to see her tears, had buried him in an unmarked grave beyond the walls because Omegas didn't deserve proper rites, had swallowed her grief like poison and kept surviving, because that was what she'd always done. But 3 days ago, everything had changed. The physician Eric had summoned for Lady Margot's fainting spells had examined Sage too, a casual cruelty her brother had ordered just to humiliate her before the visiting nobles. "To ensure the servants aren't carrying anything contagious," he'd said with that smile that made her skin crawl. The physician's face had gone pale when he'd pressed his hands to her abdomen, and Sage had known, had seen the death sentence in his eyes before he'd even opened his mouth. "She's with child, my lord, at least 3 moons along." The silence that had followed felt like the moment before a killing blow. Eric had dismissed the physician, the nobles, the other servants, had locked the door of the great hall himself, the sound of the iron bolt sliding home echoing like a funeral knell. And then he had turned to her with a fury she'd never seen before, not in 23 years of living beneath his contempt, his casual violence, his determined erasure of her existence. "Whose is it?" She hadn't answered. Some defiance she didn't know she possessed had sealed her lips, even as he'd crossed the room in 3 strides and seized her by the throat, slamming her back against the cold stone wall. The impact had driven the air from her lungs, her skull ringing against the stone, but she'd met his eyes without flinching. Let him see Tobias's memory in her face. Let him understand that she had known love, real love, even if only briefly. He could never take that from her. "The Omega," Eric had breathed, realization dawning. "You're carrying that creature's whelp. That's why you were crying over his corpse. You'd let him breed you like a common bitch in heat." "Tobias was worth 10 of you." The words had escaped before she could stop them, hoarse and defiant, and she'd seen something snap behind her brother's eyes. The first blow had split her lip. The second had dropped her to her knees, stars exploding across her vision as pain bloomed through her skull. But it was the third, Eric's boot connecting with her ribs, sending her sprawling across the stone floor, that had finally torn a scream from her throat. "You will not shame this family." His voice had gone cold, controlled, more terrifying than his rage. "You will not carry an Omega's bastard while wearing the face of a Blackwood. Father might have tolerated your existence out of weakness, but I won't make the same mistake." She'd watched through swelling eyes as he'd drawn his belt knife, the same blade he'd used on Tobias, she realized with sick horror. He'd kept a dark smear along the fuller, deliberately preserved like a trophy, a reminder, meant for her, that he could take anything she loved. "I'm going to make this quick," he had said, almost gently. "More mercy than you deserve for betraying our blood. They'll find your body in the morning, and I'll tell them you attacked me in a fit of madness. Poor, broken Sage, driven mad by the shame of her Omega mother's legacy. No one will question it. No one has ever cared about you enough to question anything." He wasn't wrong. That was the worst part. 23 years of being invisible, of being less than nothing, of having even her name scrubbed from the family records. Who would mourn her? Who would even notice she was gone? But as Eric had raised the knife, something had shifted in her chest. A warmth she didn't recognize. A stirring like wings unfolding in a space that had been empty her whole life. The child. Her child. Tobias's child. This innocent life that had done nothing wrong, that deserved a chance to exist in a world that might be kinder than the one she'd known. She would not die on her knees in her brother's hall. The words had torn from her throat in a voice she didn't recognize. Deeper, resonant, thrumming with a power that made the torches flicker and Eric's eyes widen in sudden fear. "You will not touch this child." And then Eric's knife had slashed down, slicing a burning line across her ribs instead of burying in her heart. Because he'd flinched. He'd flinched at the command in her voice, something in him responding to an authority she didn't understand. It was only a moment's hesitation, but it was enough. She'd run. Through the servants' corridors she knew by heart, past the kitchens where old Marta had screamed at the sight of her blood, out the small gate by the kennels that Eric always forgot to lock, into the winter night with no shoes, no coat, nothing but the clothes on her back and the child in her belly and the desperate animal need to survive. That had been 3 days ago. 3 days of hiding in frozen hollows and abandoned shepherds' huts, of pressing handfuls of snow against her wound to slow the bleeding, of walking when every step sent agony lancing through her side. 3 days of whispering to the child inside her, promising that she would find somewhere safe, that she would protect them both, that love was stronger than blood and hate and all the cruelty in the world. She didn't know if that was true, but she had to believe it. The Nightshade territory appeared through the trees like a ghost, ruins of what had once been a great hall, its walls crumbling but still standing, smoke rising from a chimney that suggested life within. Sage's failing vision couldn't make out details, but she could smell wood smoke and cooking meat, and something underneath it all, something wild and green and alive. Pine and snow and pack, wolves. A pack. Even a small one, in a land she'd heard whispered about only in rumors. The Nightshade pack had been destroyed. Everyone knew the story. The council's judgment, the massacre, the 12 survivors left to freeze in the ruins of their home. A warning to any who might challenge the old ways. But someone had survived. Someone was rebuilding. Maybe they would help her. Maybe they would turn her away. Maybe they would kill her on sight, a trespasser bleeding across their border. It didn't matter anymore. Her legs had stopped obeying her commands somewhere in the last 100 yards, her body finally surrendering to 3 days of blood loss and cold and exhaustion. The snow rose up to meet her in a silent rush, shockingly soft against her frozen cheek, and her last thought before the darkness claimed her was of the child, the tiny flutter of life still fighting beneath her heart. "Stay alive, little one. Stay alive. I'm sorry I couldn't take you further." And then there was nothing but cold and silence, and the distant sound of wolves howling in the winter night. Caspian Nightshade smelled the blood before he saw her. He had been running the border with Yara, as he did every dawn and dusk, checking the territory markers and watching for any sign of the Council's return. 12 survivors. That was all that remained of his pack, his family, his legacy. 12 wolves who had somehow escaped the slaughter and crawled back to the ruins to rebuild. 3 years of scratching existence from frozen ground, of hunting in forests that barely sustain them, of watching the horizon for enemies who might return to finish what they'd started. But this scent wasn't council soldiers. This was something else entirely. Blood. Yara growled beside him, her dark wolf hackles rising. Human. And she broke off, confusion rippling through their pack bond. Pregnant, Caspian finished, already shifting direction toward the scent. A pregnant woman, wounded, alone. At our border? Yara's skepticism was warranted. No one came to Nightshade territory. They were pariahs, ghosts, a cautionary tale other packs told their children. The few traders who still dealt with them never crossed the boundary stones. It could be a trap. The Council? The Council sends soldiers, not bleeding pregnant women. Caspian pushed faster through the snow, his wolf surging against his skin with an urgency he didn't understand. Something was pulling him forward, some instinct deeper than pack bonds or survival training. He needed to find the source of that blood. He needed to find her. Her. The thought echoed strangely in his mind, as if his wolf had recognized something his human brain couldn't yet process. He found her where the old boundary stones met the deer path, a crumpled figure in blood-stained homespun, half buried in the fresh snowfall. She looked like death, skin gray-white with cold, lips blue, frost crystals forming on lashes that lay still against hollow cheeks. But when he dropped to his knees beside her and pressed his fingers to her throat, he found a pulse, thready and weak, but present. She's alive. His voice came out rough, strange in his own ears. Barely. Yara had shifted to human form, her dark skin pebbling in the cold as she crouched beside him. Caspian, we can't. Look at her. She's council bred. I can smell it on her clothes. Whoever she is, she brings trouble we can't afford. She brings a child who didn't choose any of this. He was already gathering the woman into his arms, careful of the wound he could see through her torn dress, the ugly slash across her ribs that had been bleeding for days. She weighed nothing. Skin and bones, and the gentle curve of pregnancy, a life balanced on the edge of ending. I won't leave her to die in the snow. Our people will protest. 12 mouths are already too many for our hunting grounds, and you want to add a stranger and her pup? Our people survived a massacre. Caspian started back toward the ruins, the woman's head lolling against his shoulder, her frozen fingers twitching unconsciously toward her belly even in unconsciousness, protecting the child, even now. They understand that mercy is the only thing separating us from the monsters who tried to destroy us. We don't abandon the helpless. Yara's silence spoke her disagreement, but she followed. She always did in the end. 3 years of rebuilding had forged a loyalty between them that could survive arguments, even ones they didn't resolve. Caspian carried the stranger through the crumbling gates of his ancestors' hall, past the scorch marks that still stained the stones, into the great room where his remaining pack had built their fragile new life. Heads turned, whispers began. He ignored them all, focused on the woman in his arms and the inexplicable pull that had settled in his chest. She stirred as he laid her on the furs beside the central fire, a small sound of pain escaping her split lips. Her eyes fluttered, just for a moment, and he caught a glimpse of gray-green depths, the color of winter sage. Safe, he told her, though she probably couldn't hear. You're safe now. Her hand found his wrist, grip weak as a child's, and something electric sparked through the contact. Caspian's breath caught. His wolf, always restless beneath his skin, went suddenly, completely still. Then her eyes closed again, and she slipped back into unconsciousness, taking the spark with her. But Caspian stayed beside her, his hand still trapped beneath her cold fingers, and knew with absolute certainty that nothing would ever be the same. The fever came for her on the second night. Caspian had barely left her side since carrying her through the gates, rising only when Yara insisted he eat something, or when old Aldrich, the closest thing they had to a healer since the massacre, needed space to work on the wound across her ribs. The slash was deep but clean, made by a blade that had been sharp and wielded with intent to kill. Someone had tried to murder this woman, this pregnant stranger who had crawled to his border with nothing but desperation keeping her alive. The thought made his wolf pace restlessly beneath his skin, a low growl building in his chest that he couldn't quite suppress. The wound is stitched and cleaned, Aldrich had told him that first evening, his weathered hands still stained with her blood. But she's lost too much. 3 days of bleeding, 3 days of cold. It's a miracle the child still lives. If she makes it through the night, she might survive. If the fever doesn't take her. The fever had taken her anyway. She burned against the furs, her skin flushed crimson where it had been gray-white with cold, her breath coming in shallow gasps that made Caspian's chest ache with helpless fury. He pressed cool cloths to her forehead, dribbled water between her cracked lips, and listened to her mutter in her delirium, fragments of words that painted a picture of horror. Sometimes her voice seemed to resonate strangely, as if something ancient was stirring just beneath her fevered words, something that made his wolf go still and attentive. "Tobias," she whispered, tears leaking from beneath her closed lids. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. He killed you, and I couldn't stop him. Eric, please, please don't. The child didn't do anything wrong. I won't tell anyone about father. I promise I won't tell. Just let me go. Just let me." Caspian's hands had stilled on the cloth, his wolf suddenly alert, ears pricked at the fragments of story emerging from her fever dreams. Eric, father, someone named Tobias who had been killed. The child she kept protecting even in unconsciousness, one hand always curved over the gentle swell of her belly, as if she could shield the life within through sheer will alone. What had been done to this woman? On the third morning, the fever broke. Caspian had fallen into an exhausted doze beside her, his hand still loosely holding hers. She seemed calmer when he touched her, her restless movements settling, her breathing evening out. He wasn't sure what it meant, wasn't sure why his wolf demanded the contact with an intensity that bordered on compulsion. He only knew that leaving her felt wrong in a way he couldn't explain, so he stayed. The change in her breathing woke him, a shift from the shallow fever gasps to something deeper, more natural. Her fingers twitched in his grip, and he opened his eyes to find her watching him. Gray-green eyes, the color of winter sage. Clearer now than they had been in that brief moment when he'd first laid her down, but shadowed with confusion and fear. She was looking at him like he might be a threat, her body tensing beneath the furs, and he realized with a start that she was about to run. "Easy." He kept his voice low, gentle, the tone he used with frightened animals caught in hunting snares. "You're safe. No one here will hurt you." She didn't believe him. He could see it in the way her eyes darted around the room, cataloging exits, measuring distances, calculating whether she could escape before he caught her. A survivor's instincts, honed by years of living among predators. "Where am I?" Her voice came out as a rasp, rough from days of fever and disuse. "How long? The child!" Her free hand flew to her belly, panic flashing across her features, and Caspian watched her whole body sag with relief when she felt the flutter of movement beneath her palm. Still alive. Oh, thank the gods. Still alive. "The child is strong," he said. "Aldrich, our healer, Says you're both fighters. He's never seen anyone survive what you've been through. Her eyes snapped back to his face, wariness replacing relief. You know what I've been through? Only fragments. You spoke in your fever. He released her hand slowly, giving her space, and saw something flicker in her expression. Surprise, maybe, that he would surrender even that small advantage. Someone named Eric hurt you. Someone named Tobias died. You were running to protect your child. That's all I know. The names landed like physical blows. She flinched at each one, her face cycling through grief and rage and fear, before settling into something carefully blank, a mask she'd clearly worn for years. Who are you? She asked instead of responding. Where is this place? My name is Caspian Nightshade. This is... He gestured around the great room, with its fire-scarred walls and patched roof and stubborn survivors carving a life from ruins. This is what remains of the Nightshade Pack. You collapsed at our border 3 days ago. I brought you here. He watched understanding dawn in her eyes, followed immediately by fear. Everyone knew the Nightshade story. Everyone knew what the Council had done. The pack that was destroyed, she whispered. You're the survivors. 12 of us. 13 now if you stay. He said it simply without pressure, though his wolf was snarling at the very idea of her leaving. You're welcome here as long as you need. No questions asked. No debts owed. Why? The word came out sharp, suspicious. You don't know me. You don't know what I've done, what I'm running from. I could bring danger to your door. I will bring danger to your door. The man who did this. She touched her bandaged ribs, wincing. He won't stop looking for me. He can't let me live. Then we'll face him together. She stared at him like he'd sprouted a second head. You don't even know my name. Caspian smiled despite himself, despite the gravity of the moment, because her bewilderment was so complete it was almost funny. Had no one ever offered her help without expecting something in return? Had no one ever looked at her and seen someone worth protecting? Then tell me your name, he said, and we'll start from there. She was silent for a long moment, something warring behind those winter sage eyes. He could see the walls she'd built, the defenses she'd constructed over years of being invisible, unwanted, unsafe. He could see how desperately she wanted to believe him and how terrified she was of that wanting. Sage, she finally whispered. My name is Sage. Sage. He let the name settle on his tongue, tasting it. Something about it felt right, felt true in a way that made his wolf hum with satisfaction. Rest now, Sage. Heal. When you're stronger, we'll talk about what comes next. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but exhaustion was already dragging her eyes closed, her body surrendering to the healing sleep it desperately needed. Her hand twitched toward his, an unconscious gesture that made his breath catch, and then she was asleep again. Deeper this time, more peaceful. Caspian stayed beside her, watching the firelight play across her features, and tried to understand why his wolf was so convinced that this stranger, this broken woman with her impossible burdens, was the most important thing he would ever protect. The days blurred together after that. Sage slept more than she woke for the first week, her body demanding rest as it slowly knit itself back together. Aldrich visited twice daily to check her wound and monitor the child's heartbeat, his initial skepticism about the stranger in their midst softening as he watched her fight to survive. Once he lingered after changing her dressings, his weathered brow furrowed. There's something in her blood I can't place, he'd told Caspian quietly. A resonance. Old bloodline, maybe. I've only ever smelled anything like it once before, in the old Alpha families, before the purge. Even Yara's protests grew quieter, though she still watched Sage with suspicion whenever she thought Caspian wasn't looking. He was always looking. He couldn't explain it to himself, let alone to his pack. He'd never been particularly drawn to anyone before, not in the years before the massacre, when eligible wolves from neighboring packs had been paraded before him in hopes of alliance, and certainly not in the desperate years since. Building a pack from 12 survivors left no time for matters of the heart. He'd accepted that he would likely never mate, never have heirs, never know the bond that had made his parents strong enough to face death together when the council came. But something about Sage called to him in ways that defied logic. He told himself it was protectiveness, nothing more. She was vulnerable, pregnant, alone. Of course, his alpha instincts would respond to someone in need. But that explanation felt thin, inadequate to describe the pull he felt whenever she stirred, the way his wolf went calm and quiet when he sat beside her. The strange certainty that had settled in his bones the moment he'd smelled her blood on the wind. On the 9th day, she was strong enough to sit up. On the 10th, she insisted on walking. "I need to—" She gripped the edge of the bed, her jaw set with determination even as her legs trembled beneath her. "I can't just lie here. I need to see where I am. I need to know the layout of—" "The exits," Caspian finished, understanding. "The defensible positions. The places to hide if someone comes." She met his eyes, startled. "Yes. I'll show you." He offered his arm, ignoring Aldrich's sputtering protests about rest and recovery. "Every corner of this place. You'll know it as well as I do by the time you're healed." He watched her war with herself, the ingrained suspicion that said his offer must come with hidden costs, fighting against the practical recognition that she needed this knowledge to feel safe. Practicality won. She took his arm, her fingers settling lightly above his elbow, and he walked her slowly through the ruins of his ancestors' hall. She was more beautiful in daylight than she had been in the fire's glow. Thinner than she should be, her cheekbones too sharp and her collarbones too prominent, but there was a fierce intelligence in her eyes that captivated him. And his wolf behaved strangely around her, going quiet and attentive in a way it never did around anyone else, not even his own betas, as if something in her commanded respect on a level deeper than rank. She noted every detail he pointed out, asked clever questions about sight lines and escape routes, and gradually, so gradually he almost missed it, began to relax in his presence. This was the Great Hall, he told her as they entered the largest chamber, where the massive stone hearth still stood despite the scorch marks crawling up its face. "Before the council came, we would host gatherings here. Festivals, pack celebrations. My mother used to dance on that table." He pointed to a scarred wooden surface now used for food preparation. "When she'd had too much wine and my father pretended to be scandalized." Sage's lips curved, just slightly. "Your mother sounds like she was wonderful." She was. The grief was an old ache now, dulled by years but never quite gone. They killed her first. You know, the council soldiers. Because she was Omega-born and they wanted my father to watch. Sage went very still beside him. Omega-born? Her mother, my grandmother, was an Omega. It made some wolves consider our bloodline tainted. The council used it as part of their justification. He said it matter-of-factly, though the old anger still burned beneath the words. As if love could ever diminish a bloodline. As if choosing a mate for their heart instead of their rank was somehow shameful. She was staring at him with an expression he couldn't read, her gray-green eyes wide and searching. He felt suddenly exposed, as if he'd said too much, revealed too much of the wounds he usually kept hidden. "I'm sorry," he started to say, but she shook her head. "No, don't apologize." Her voice was strange, thick with something that might have been hope. I've never heard anyone say that before. About Omegas, about love not caring about rank. It's the truth. It should be." She looked away, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "But the world doesn't seem to agree." He wanted to ask about the child's father, about Tobias, the name she'd cried in her fever. about who she really was and what had been done to her, and why someone had tried to kill both her and the innocent life she carried. But she wasn't ready, and he wouldn't push. Instead, he continued the tour. By the 13th day, Sage was moving through the ruins with increasing confidence, learning the rhythms of pack life with an adaptability that impressed everyone who watched her. She offered to help in the kitchens. "I've been a servant my whole life. I know how to work." And old Marta accepted gratefully. Their hunting returns stretched thin enough that every extra hand mattered. She was quiet among the pack members, watchful, but Caspian noticed the way her shoulders gradually lowered as the days passed, without anyone raising a hand to her or speaking to her with contempt. She was learning that safety could exist. He watched her learn it, and something in his chest ached with tenderness. But fear still lived in her bones. It showed in the way she startled at sudden sounds, in the nightmares that had her waking with choked screams, in the constant vigilance that never fully left her eyes. Whoever Eric was, whatever he had done, the man's shadow stretched across every moment of Sage's existence. On the morning of the 14th day, everything changed. Caspian was in the armory, a grand name for the small room where they kept their hunting weapons, when he heard Sage's voice from the direction of the main gate, not speaking, arguing, and beneath the argument, the unmistakable tension of someone ready to flee. He was moving before he consciously decided to, his wolf surging forward with sudden urgency. Through the ruined corridors, past the startled faces of pack members who had never seen their alpha run, until he burst through the gate to find Sage standing at the boundary stones with a pack slung over one shoulder. She was leaving. His wolf howled in protest, a sound so loud in his mind that he wasn't sure it hadn't escaped his throat. But he forced himself to slow, to approach with measured steps rather than the desperate sprint his instincts demanded. "Going somewhere?" She spun to face him, guilt and defiance warring in her expression. "I have to go. I've stayed too long already. Eric will be looking for me. His soldiers will be combing every territory within 100 miles. If they find me here, if they connect me to your pack, then we'll face them together. I told you that. You don't understand." Her voice cracked, her careful control slipping. "You've rebuilt something here. 12 survivors, you said. 12 people who lived through horror and found a way to keep going. I won't be the reason they lose that. I won't bring death to your door just because you were kind enough to save my life." "You think we survived by turning away the vulnerable?" Caspian moved closer, watching her tense but not retreat. "You think my pack would want me to let a pregnant woman walk to her death just to avoid risk? Your pack doesn't know what's coming. I do. Then tell me." He was close enough now to see the tears she was fighting, the terror that lived just beneath her brave facade. "Tell me what you're running from, Sage. Let me help." "You can't." The words came out broken, barely audible. "No one can. I'm nothing. Do you understand? I'm a servant. A bastard. A disgrace to a family that never wanted me. The child I carry—" Her hand pressed protectively against her belly, as if she could shield it from even the mention. "The child's father was an Omega. My own brother killed him for daring to touch me, and now he wants to kill us both because we're an embarrassment, an abomination. Proof that the family's bloodline has been tainted by love?" Caspian finished softly. "By choosing someone for their heart instead of their rank?" She stared at him, her mouth still open around words that wouldn't come. "I told you about my grandmother," he continued, taking another step closer. "About my mother. Do you think I care about the child's rank, Sage? Do you think anyone in this pack, in a pack that was nearly destroyed because the council decided our bloodline was too Omega touched to deserve to exist, do you think any of us would condemn an innocent life because of who their father was?" She was crying now, silent tears tracking down her cheeks, and her whole body was trembling with the effort of holding herself together. He wanted to reach for her, to pull her close, but he held back. "I can't stay. she whispered. I can't let you risk. I'm asking you to stay. He cut her off, his voice rougher than he intended. Not for the pack's sake, for mine. I'm asking you to trust me enough to stay, at least until… He reached for her wrist. Later, he would wonder what made him do it. What instinct overrode his careful restraint and made him close the distance between them, made his fingers wrap around the delicate bones of her wrist, where her pulse fluttered like a trapped bird. The moment his skin touched hers, the world stopped. Heat flooded through him, not the heat of fever or exertion, but something else entirely. Something that started where their skin met and spread outward in waves of golden warmth, filling every corner of his being with a sensation he had never felt before but recognized immediately. Mate. His wolf went absolutely still, then surged forward with a howl of fierce, exultant joy. Every nerve in Caspian's body was suddenly attuned to her, the hitch in her breath, the race of her pulse beneath his fingers, the way her scent shifted from fierce sweat to something sweeter, deeper, headier. Like sage and honey and something uniquely her, a fragrance that called to him on a level beyond words. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at her with eyes he knew had gone molten gold, his wolf's presence surging so close to the surface that he felt his canines lengthening in his mouth. Mate, he breathed, the word torn from somewhere deep in his chest. You're my… Sage made a sound like she'd been struck. Her whole body went rigid, her eyes widening until he could see white all around the gray-green, and she was staring at him with an expression of absolute terror. But not just terror. Beneath the fear, something else was happening. Her scent was shifting again, growing stronger, richer, and her pupils were dilating in a way that had nothing to do with the morning light. She was feeling it too, the bond, the pull, the recognition that lived deeper than thought or reason. No, she gasped, but she wasn't pulling away. Her fingers had tightened around his, not pushing, but holding, as if her body was refusing to obey her conscious mind. No, this can't. I'm nothing, I told you. I'm a servant, a disgrace. I carry another man's child. You carry a child who will be mine in every way that matters. The words came out without thought, absolute truth speaking itself through his lips. You're my mate. The rest of it, none of it matters. None of it could ever matter. She was shaking her head, but tears were spilling down her cheeks now. Not tears of fear, he realized, but something rawer. Hope. Desperate, terrified hope that she didn't know how to hold. You don't… Her voice broke. You don't know what I am, what I come from. My mother was an Omega, my brother is a monster, my family… Your mother was Omega? He laughed, the sound rough with emotion. Sage, I just told you. My grandmother was Omega. My mother was Omega-born. This is the Nightshade Pack. We were nearly destroyed because the council decided our blood was too mixed to let us live. Do you think I give a damn about bloodlines? The careful mask she'd worn for 23 years finally shattered. He watched it happen. Watched the walls she'd spent a lifetime building shudder and begin to fall. Her lips parted, a small sound escaping that was half sob and half laugh, and she swayed toward him like a flower toward the sun. Mate, she whispered, testing the word on her tongue. But I've never… My wolf was suppressed since I was a child. Herbs. Eric gave me herbs to keep her silent. I didn't even know I had… She broke off with a gasp, her free hand flying to her chest. Her eyes went unfocused, turned inward, and Caspian felt it through the bond that was already forming between them, felt the stirring of something that had been buried for years, something wild and fierce, and finally waking, her wolf. She's there, Sage breathed, wonder transforming her tear-stained face. She's been there all along, and she's howling. She's howling for me. He stepped closer, cupping her face with his free hand, tilting it up so she couldn't look away. For us, because this is what we are, Sage. Mates. Partners. Two halves of something that was always meant to be whole. She stared up at him with those winter sage eyes, and he watched the last of her resistance crumble. I'm terrified, she admitted in a whisper. I know. I don't know how to trust. I don't know how to believe that someone won't. I know. He smoothed a tear from her cheek with his thumb, marveling at the softness of her skin, the way her scent was wrapping around him like a promise. You don't have to know yet, you just have to stay. Let me prove it. Let me show you what it means to be cherished, Sage. Let me love you without conditions or requirements or ranks. Let me love this child because they're part of you, and you're part of me, and that's all that matters. Caspian. His name in her mouth was the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. I can't. Stay. He made it a request, not a command, though everything in him wanted to demand, to claim, to never let her go. Just stay. The moment stretched between them, fragile as spun glass. Then Sage, broken, beautiful, impossibly brave Sage, took a shaking breath and nodded. I'll stay, she whispered. I'll try. And when her fingers threaded through his, holding on like she finally had something worth holding on to, Caspian felt the bond pulse between them like a second heartbeat. His. She was his. And he was going to spend the rest of his life making sure she knew exactly what that meant. He led her back through the gates of the ruined hall, his hand wrapped firmly around hers, and felt the curious stares of his pack like physical touches against his skin. They would have questions. Yara especially would have objections. But right now, none of that mattered. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the woman beside him and the fragile trust she'd placed in his keeping. He took her to his chambers, not for any reason beyond privacy, beyond giving her space to process what had just happened without an audience. The room was sparse by the standards of what he'd grown up with, but he'd managed to salvage a few comforts from the ruins. A bed with furs thick enough to keep out the winter cold, a desk where he worked on the endless logistics of keeping 12 wolves alive, a window that looked out over the forest where he'd found her. Sage stood in the center of the room, arms wrapped around herself, looking small and overwhelmed and achingly uncertain. The bond hummed between them, and he could feel her emotions through it. Faint, distant, not yet fully formed, but clear enough to read. Fear, wonder, the desperate want to believe that this was real. You should rest, he said, though every instinct screamed at him to hold her, to wrap himself around her until the fear faded and only the wonder remained. Your body is still healing. The bond, it can be overwhelming at first. You're not going to... She stopped, her cheeks flushing, and he understood what she was trying to ask. I'm not going to claim you. He kept his voice gentle, though his wolf snarled in protest at even saying the words. Not until you're ready, not until you ask me to. This isn't... Sage, the mate bond doesn't erase consent. It doesn't give me the right to demand anything from you. It just means we belong to each other, in whatever way we choose to build that belonging. She stared at him like he was speaking a foreign language. Where I come from, mates take what they want. They don't ask. Then, you've been surrounded by the wrong people. He crossed to the door, giving her space, though every step away from her felt like walking through deep water. I'll be in the Great Hall if you need anything. Rest. Heal. We have time. He was almost through the door when her voice stopped him. Caspian. He turned back to find her watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Something between confusion and wonder and the first tentative stirrings of something that might, one day, become trust. Thank you, she whispered. For everything. For not, she gestured helplessly. For being different. I'm not different. He held her gaze, letting her see the truth in his eyes. I'm just what a mate should be, what anyone should be, to someone they care about. You've just never had the chance to see it before. She didn't respond, but something in her expression softened. A wall coming down, a door creaking open. He left her there to rest and spent the next hour in the great hall explaining to his increasingly agitated Beta that yes, the stranger was his mate. And no, he would not be sending her away. And yes, Yara could take her objections and choke on them for all he cared. It was perhaps not his most diplomatic moment. But when he returned to his chambers that evening to find Sage asleep in his bed, curled around a pillow like she was holding on to something precious, one hand resting protectively on her belly, he couldn't bring himself to care about diplomacy. He stood in the doorway and watched her breathe, and felt the bond settling into place between them like a key turning in a lock, and knew that he would burn the world to ash before he let anyone hurt her again. The confrontation came on the third morning after the bond's awakening. Sage had spent the intervening days in a strange kind of limbo, drawn to Caspian with a force she couldn't explain, terrified of that same pull, oscillating between hope and suspicion as she tried to make sense of a world that had suddenly become utterly unfamiliar. Her wolf was awake now, truly awake for the first time in her life, and the presence in her chest was both exhilarating and overwhelming. Every scent seemed sharper, every sound clearer, and beneath it all pulsed the golden thread of the bond, connecting her to the man who had saved her life. She was in the great hall that morning, helping Marta prepare the communal breakfast, when the argument began. "This is unacceptable." The voice was sharp, carrying across the hall with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. Sage looked up from the bread she was slicing to find a dark-skinned woman striding toward the central table, her expression thunderous. Yara, she remembered. The Beta, the one who had questioned bringing her inside from the beginning. Caspian was at the table, going over territory maps with two of the younger wolves, but he looked up at his Beta's approach with a calm that seemed to only infuriate her further. "Something wrong, Yara?" "You know what's wrong." Yara slammed her palm on the table, making the maps jump. "The whole pack is talking about it. Our alpha, mate bonded to a stranger. A pregnant stranger. A disgraced pregnant stranger from a council-allied family, if the rumors about her scent are true." Her eyes cut to Sage, cold and dismissive. "A nobody who showed up at our border half dead and pregnant with another man's child, and you're going to make her our Luna?" The hall had gone silent. Every wolf present was watching, and Sage could feel the weight of their stares like stones pressing against her chest. She wanted to run, wanted to hide, wanted to be anywhere but here, exposed to judgment she knew she deserved. But before she could move, Caspian rose from his seat. The change in him was subtle, but absolute. One moment he was the man who had held her hand and spoken soft words of comfort. The next, he was something else entirely, something ancient and dangerous, a king in the bones of a ruined hall. And when he spoke, his voice carried a command that made every wolf in the room instinctively lower their eyes. "Sage is under my protection." The words fell like stones into still water, ripples of power spreading outward from their impact. "She is my mate. She carries a child who will be my child in every way that matters. If you have concerns about pack resources or territorial security, I will hear them in private, as is proper. But if you question her worth in public again, if you speak to her, or about her with anything less than the respect owed to my Luna—" He paused, and the silence was absolute. "Then you question me. And I think you know better than that, Yara." Yara's jaw was tight, a muscle ticking beneath her dark skin. For a long moment she held his gaze, something like defiance flickering in her eyes. But Caspian didn't waver, didn't blink, just stood there, radiating authority and absolutely certain conviction, until finally, Yara lowered her head. Forgive me, my alpha. The words were stiff, forced, but they were spoken. I overstepped. You did. Caspian's voice softened, just slightly. I understand your concerns, Yara. Truly, I do. But Sage is not a threat. She's not a trap or a liability. She's my mate. And this pack, our pack, will accept her as such. Yara nodded once, sharply, and turned away. But as she passed Sage's position by the bread table, she paused. He's never spoken to me like that before, she said, low enough that only Sage could hear. Not in 3 years of rebuilding. Not even when I disagreed with his most dangerous decisions. Her dark eyes met Sage's, and there was something in them that wasn't quite hostility, something closer to grudging acknowledgement. Whatever you are to him, you're more than any of us realized. She walked away before Sage could respond. And then Caspian was there, appearing at Sage's side like he'd crossed the room without her seeing him move. His hand found hers, squeezing gently, and when she looked up at him, the fierce authority had melted back into something warmer. I'm sorry, he murmured. I should have anticipated. No. Sage shook her head, her throat tight with a feeling she had no name for. No, She struggled to find words, to express the swell of emotion pressing against her ribs. No one has ever done that before. Defended me. In front of everyone. Without conditions or... Her voice broke. Caspian pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in the middle of the hall, in front of every wolf who had watched their beta submit. Let them see. Let them understand. This was what he was. This was what she meant to him. Get used to it, he said against her hair. You're not invisible anymore, Sage. You never will be again. And standing there in the circle of his arms, feeling the bond pulse warm and steady between them, Sage let herself believe, just for a moment, that she might finally have found a place to belong. The warmth of Caspian's arms lingered on her skin long after he released her, a phantom embrace that seemed to pulse in time with the bond between them. Sage found herself returning to that moment again and again over the following days, replaying the fierce certainty in his voice, the way the entire hall had gone silent before his authority. No one had ever stood for her like that. No one had ever looked at a room full of people and declared her worth defending. It terrified her almost as much as it made her heart ache with something she was afraid to name. 3 days passed in a haze of small discoveries. Sage learned the rhythms of the Nightshade Pack, how Aldrich always rose before dawn to check the eastern perimeter, how Yara's gruffness concealed a meticulous attention to detail that kept their limited supplies stretched to their absolute limits, how Kira sang old songs while she worked in the kitchen, her voice carrying through the stone corridors like a gentle ghost. There were 12 of them in total. Just 12 wolves holding together the bones of what had once been a great territory. And yet there was something fierce and unbreakable in them, a determination that refused to bow to the devastation they'd survived. Sage tried to make herself useful. She helped Kira with cooking and mending, tasks her hands remembered from years of service in her brother's house. She stayed quiet during meals, kept to the edges of conversations, made herself small and unobtrusive the way she'd learned to do long before she could remember learning anything else. But Caspian wouldn't let her disappear. He found her in small moments throughout each day, a hand on her shoulder as he passed, a quiet word of greeting, a look across the hall that seemed to see straight through to the frightened girl she kept hidden beneath her careful composure. And the bond between them grew stronger with each passing hour, a golden thread that hummed with awareness whenever he was near. On the 3rd evening, he found her on the ramparts watching the stars, and she'd turned to say something. She couldn't even remember what. And his mouth had found hers. It was desperate and claiming, a kiss that tasted of yearning too long denied, and she'd fisted her hands in his shirt and kissed him back with a ferocity that surprised them both. When they'd broken apart, breathless, he'd pressed his forehead to hers and whispered, I've been wanting to do that since I carried you through the gates. She hadn't trusted herself to speak. She'd just pulled him back down and kissed him again. On the fourth morning after her public acceptance, Sage woke to find Caspian already gone from his chambers. She'd been sleeping in a small room adjacent to his, close enough that she could feel his presence through the wall, far enough that propriety remained intact. The arrangement had been his idea, offered with such careful respect that she'd agreed before she could think to refuse. Now she rose and dressed quickly, her swollen belly making the simple act of bending to tie her boots into a small adventure. The child within her stirred, a flutter of movement that still made her breath catch with wonder and fear in equal measure. How was she supposed to protect this tiny life when she could barely protect herself? How was she supposed to give this baby the love it deserved when she'd never known what that felt like? She pushed the thoughts away and made her way down to the great hall, expecting to find the usual quiet bustle of morning preparations. Instead, she found chaos. Wolves she didn't recognize stood in the center of the hall, their bearing unmistakably military. They wore the crimson and black of the High Council's guard, and at their head stood a figure that made Sage's blood turn to ice in her veins. Eric. Her brother looked exactly as she remembered, tall and broad-shouldered. His dark hair swept back from a face that could have been handsome if not for the cruelty that lived behind his pale eyes. He was dressed in formal traveling clothes, a sword at his hip, and he stood before Caspian with the arrogant confidence of a man who had never been denied anything he wanted. Simply asking for the return of stolen property, Eric was saying, his voice carrying that smooth, reasonable tone that had always preceded his worst acts of violence. Surely you understand, Alpha Caspian. The girl is a fugitive from justice, a murderer. I've come to bring her home to face the consequences of her crimes. Sage's hand found the doorframe, gripping it hard enough that the wood creaked beneath her fingers. Murderer. He was calling her a murderer. The hypocrisy of it made something dark and wounded howl inside her chest, because she knew what he had done. She'd seen the powder in their father's wine. She'd watched Lord Blackwood waste away over months, convinced he was simply aging, never suspecting that his own son was feeding him poison one careful dose at a time. And when she'd confronted Eric, when she demanded to know what he was doing, he'd smiled at her with all the warmth of a winter grave. "Little Sage," he'd said, "little half-blood servant playing at being family. Do you think anyone would believe you? Do you think anyone would care? Father's fortune comes to me when he dies. And you get nothing. You are nothing. Remember your place." She hadn't run that night. Not yet. Instead, she'd done the only thing she could think of. She'd crept into his study while he slept and found the letters. Correspondence between Eric and a council member detailing everything. She'd folded them into the locket she wore at her throat. Her mother's locket, the only thing Elena had left her, and kept them against her skin from that day forward, knowing that if she stayed, she'd be next. Eric couldn't afford to let her live, not with what she knew. And the child growing inside her, the child of the gentle Omega who had loved her, who had died trying to protect her when Eric's men came hunting, that child was just another loose end he needed to tie off. Now he was here, standing in the hall of the one place she'd thought might be safe, spinning lies with the ease of long practice. "I have documentation," Eric continued, pulling a scroll from his coat. "Signed by the council itself. The girl is wanted for the murder of Lord Hector Blackwood, my father and her own. She fled before she could be questioned, taking valuable family heirlooms with her. I've tracked her here, and I'm gratified to find her still alive. The council will want to question her themselves." Caspian hadn't moved throughout this speech. He stood with his arms crossed over his chest, his expression unreadable, but Sage could feel the tension radiating through their bond like heat from a forge. When he spoke, his voice was carefully neutral. That's quite an accusation, Lord Blackwood. Murder of a parent is a serious charge. It is. Eric's smile was all teeth. Which is why I've brought sufficient forces to ensure the prisoner's safe transport back to Council lands. You'll forgive the precaution, but given the reduced state of your territory, I thought it best to come prepared. The insult was subtle, but unmistakable. Reduced state. As if the devastation of the Nightshade Pack was something to be mentioned casually, a weakness to be exploited. Sage saw Aldrich's hand move toward his weapon, saw Yara's eyes flash with barely contained fury, and knew that Eric was doing exactly what he always did, probing for vulnerabilities, testing boundaries, establishing dominance through carefully calibrated cruelty. The woman you're looking for, Caspian said slowly, is under my protection. Eric's smile flickered. I'm sorry? She came to my territory wounded and in need. I granted her sanctuary. Whatever claims you have against her, they'll need to be substantiated before I consider releasing her to your custody. Substantiated? Eric's voice rose slightly, the smooth mask slipping just a fraction. I have council documentation, which could easily be forged. Caspian's tone remained even, almost pleasant, but there was steel beneath the words. Forgive me, Lord Blackwood, but the council has not always been friendly to Nightshade interests. You'll understand if I'm reluctant to hand over a pregnant woman based solely on papers that may or may not be genuine. Sage's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. Pregnant woman. He hadn't called her his mate, hadn't revealed the bond between them. Was that protection, or was he leaving himself room to bargain? The woman is a servant, Eric said, and now there was an edge to his voice, frustration bleeding through the polished facade. A half-blood bastard who got above herself. She has no value to you, no political significance. Why would you risk council displeasure for someone so insignificant? Perhaps I simply don't like being told what to do in my own hall. The tension in the room ratcheted up another notch. Sage could see Eric's soldiers shifting, hands moving toward weapons, and she knew with sickening certainty that this was about to become violent. 12 wolves against Eric's forces. They might be able to hold them off. But at what cost? How many of these people who had shown her kindness would die because she'd brought her brother's wrath down upon them? She had to stop this, had to do something. Before she could think better of it, Sage stepped forward into the hall. Every eye turned toward her, and she saw Eric's expression shift from frustration to triumph as he caught sight of her. Sage. Her name rolled off his tongue like poison. There you are, little sister. I've been so worried about you. The lie was so blatant, so absurd that she almost laughed. Instead, she drew herself up to her full height, not much, but enough to meet his gaze directly, and said, I'm sure you have been. Worried I might live long enough to tell someone the truth. Something dangerous flickered in Eric's eyes. The truth? The truth is that you murdered our father and fled like the coward you are. The truth is that you've been filling these poor wolves' heads with lies and deceptions. The truth. The truth is that I watched you poison him. Sage's voice didn't waver, even though her hands were shaking. For months. I saw you putting the powder in his wine. I confronted you, and you promised to kill me too if I didn't keep my mouth shut. The hall went utterly silent. Eric's composure cracked, just for a moment, before he forced it back into place. Lies. Desperate lies from a desperate woman. You see, Alpha Caspian? This is what she does. She manipulates. She deceives. She's been doing it her whole life, pretending to be meek and harmless while scheming for... I have proof. The words fell from her lips before she could stop them, and she saw Eric go very, very still. What did you say? Proof. Sage's hand moved to her throat, to the place where a thin chain hung hidden beneath her dress, placed there in the snow before she'd reached Nightshade, kept safe against her skin through every hardship. Letters. Between you and the council member who promised you Nightshade territory if you could manufacture evidence of their instability. Letters that detail exactly how much money changed hands. Letters that explain why you were so eager to have father dead, because he would never have agreed to your schemes. Eric's face had gone pale. You're bluffing. Am I? Sage pulled the chain free, revealing the small locket that hung from it. Her mother's locket. The one thing she'd never taken off. The one thing that had survived the flight through the snow. I found these in your study weeks ago, the night I discovered the poison. I've worn them against my skin every day since because I knew you'd come for me eventually. I knew you'd try to finish what you started. The tension in the hall had shifted. Now it wasn't just Eric's soldiers watching with wary eyes. It was Caspian's people too, their gazes moving between Sage and her brother with dawning understanding. And Caspian himself had gone completely still, the bond between them pulsing with something fierce and protective. Those letters are forgeries, Eric said, but his voice had lost its smooth confidence. Obviously planted to discredit me. You can't seriously expect anyone to believe. Open them. Caspian's voice cut through the air like a blade. If they're forgeries, you have nothing to fear. Let's see what they say. For a long moment, no one moved. Then Eric's mask shattered completely, and what looked out from behind it was pure, undiluted hatred. You were supposed to stay broken, he snarled at Sage. You were supposed to be nothing. A half-blood servant too afraid to ever speak against me. What changed? What made you think you had the right to? You killed the father of my child. The words came out low and fierce, and Sage felt a power rising inside her, ancient and unfamiliar, stirring in the depths of her soul. Tobias, the Omega who loved me, he tried to protect me when your men came, and you cut him down like he was nothing. So no, Eric, I'm not broken. I'm just finally done being afraid of you. She opened the locket. The letters inside were thin, delicate, preserved with the obsessive care of someone who knew they might mean the difference between life and death. Sage pulled them free with trembling fingers and held them out. Not to Eric, but to Caspian. These will show you everything, she said. The conspiracy against Nightshade, the murder of my father, all of it. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to read the truth for yourself. Caspian took the letters from her hand. Their fingers brushed, and even in the midst of everything, Sage felt the bond flare between them, warm and steady and sure. He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his golden eyes, and then he began to read. The silence stretched on, broken only by the rustle of paper and Eric's increasingly ragged breathing. His soldiers looked uncertain now, glancing between their commander and the Alpha who held their futures in his hands. And Sage stood in the center of it all, exhausted and terrified and somehow, impossibly, still standing. When Caspian finished reading, he looked up. His face was carved from stone, but his eyes burned. "Take Lord Blackwood and his men into custody," he said, and his voice carried the weight of absolute command. "They will be held pending a full investigation into these charges." Eric lunged. It happened so fast that Sage barely had time to react, her brother's hand closing around her arm, a blade appearing from somewhere in his coat, the cold kiss of steel against her throat. She heard Caspian roar, felt the bond between them ignite with protective fury, but Eric was already dragging her backward, using her body as a shield. "One step closer and she dies," Eric hissed. "All of you, stay back. I'm leaving and I'm taking her with me. Try to stop me and I'll open her throat before you can—" Sage bit his hand. It wasn't a planned thing, wasn't strategic or clever. It was pure instinct, the desperate action of a cornered animal, and her teeth sank into the meat of his palm with all the force her awakening wolf could muster. Eric screamed and jerked away, the blade slicing a thin line across her collarbone as he lost his grip. And then Caspian was there, moving faster than Sage's eyes could track, and Eric was on the ground with the Alpha's hand around his throat. "You dare!" Caspian growled, and his voice had dropped into registers that no human throat should have been able to produce. "You dare threaten my mate in my own hall?" Eric's eyes went wide. "Mate? But she's nothing. She is everything." Caspian's grip tightened, and Eric's words dissolved into a strangled gurgle. "And you are going to tell me exactly what the Council promised you in exchange for destroying what remains of my pack. You're going to tell me every name, every plan, every detail." And then, his lips pulled back from teeth that were too sharp to be entirely human. "Then we'll discuss what happens to wolves who try to murder their own blood." Sage pressed her hand to the cut on her collarbone, feeling warm blood seep between her fingers. The wound wasn't deep, but it stung with a pain that seemed to spread through her entire body. She should have been frightened, should have been cowering in a corner somewhere, trembling with the aftermath of violence. Instead, she felt something else entirely. She felt powerful. Kira appeared at her side, pressing a cloth to the wound and murmuring words of comfort. But Sage barely heard her. She was watching Caspian hold her brother down, watching the man who had tormented her for as long as she could remember finally face consequences for his cruelty. And somewhere deep inside her, in a place she'd kept locked away since childhood, a wolf was howling with fierce, triumphant joy. Eric had called her nothing, had told her she was broken, insignificant, unworthy of notice or protection. But she wasn't nothing. She was a survivor. She was a mother. She was a mate. And she was finally ready to stop hiding. The great hall held its breath. Caspian's hand remained locked around Eric's throat, and Sage could see the struggle playing out across her mate's face. The primal urge to simply end the threat warring with something more measured, more calculated. His wolf wanted blood. She could feel that desire pulsing through the bond they shared, hot and fierce and protective. But he looked at her, instead of acting on it. "His fate," Caspian said, each word ground out like it cost him something, "belongs to you." Eric's eyes bulged. "You can't be serious. She's nobody. She's a half-blood servant who spread her legs for an Omega and got herself—" Caspian's grip tightened and Eric's words dissolved into choking gasps. But it wasn't the violence that made Sage step forward. It was the realization that for the first time in her entire life, she had power over the man who had tormented her since childhood. The wolf inside her, so newly awakened after years of suppression, stirred with interest. "Let him speak," Sage said, and her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Let him tell everyone exactly what he thinks of me, what he's always thought of me." Caspian's golden eyes searched her face for a long moment. Whatever he found there made him loosen his grip just enough for Eric to gulp in air, though he didn't release him entirely. The message was clear. "Speak, but remember whose mercy keeps you breathing." Eric coughed and wheezed, his face mottled red and purple. When he finally found his voice again, it was ragged with hatred. "You were a mistake. Mother should have drowned you at birth like father wanted. Instead, she hid you away, gave you to the servants, let you grow up thinking you were one of them. And you believed it. You actually believed you were nothing more than a half-blood bastard." "Because that's what you told me," Sage said quietly. "Every day. For 23 years. Because it's what you deserve to hear." Eric's lip curled. "Do you know what it was like? Watching father coddle mother's shame? Knowing that our bloodline was tainted because she couldn't keep her legs closed around that Omega lover of hers? You should have been grateful I let you live at all." The words should have hurt. Once, they would have shattered her. But standing here now, with the bond to her true mate humming warm and steady in her chest, with the child of the Omega she'd loved growing safe beneath her heart, Sage felt something unexpected. Pity. You killed our father, she said, and watched Eric's face twitch. The letters prove it. Poison in his wine, administered over months, while you blamed his declining health on grief over mother's death. You murdered him so you could claim his seat on the council, so you could trade Nightshade territory for political power. He was weak, Eric spat. Sentimental. He actually wanted to acknowledge you publicly. Did you know that? Wanted to announce that his precious Omega-born daughter had survived, that the Stormborn bloodline continued through you. I saved our family's honor by stopping him. A murmur rippled through the watching crowd. Sage saw council soldiers exchanging uneasy glances, saw the Nightshade Pack members pressing closer with expressions of grim satisfaction. This was what they needed. Not just evidence, but confession. Eric was so consumed by his contempt for her that he couldn't stop himself from proving his own guilt. And Tobias? Sage's voice cracked on the name, but she didn't look away from her brother's twisted face. The Omega who loved me, the father of my child. Why did he have to die? Something ugly flickered in Eric's eyes. He saw me. The night I put the final dose in Father's cup. Your pathetic Omega lover was skulking around the kitchens, probably looking for you, and he saw everything. I couldn't let him live after that. And when I found out he'd planted his bastard in your belly... Eric's laugh was hollow and cruel. Well, 2 problems solved with 1 sword. The grief hit her fresh, a blade between her ribs. But beneath it, the wolf that had been suppressed for so long was rising, growing stronger with each heartbeat. Her blood hummed, her vision sharpened, a pressure gathered behind her sternum. Not pain, but power, vast and ancient and hers. The Stormborn gift. Truth-speaking. The ability to compel honesty from any wolf, to force submission through the sheer weight of righteous authority. Her mother had possessed it. Her grandfather before that. It was the reason the Stormborn line had once ruled as high alphas, before politics and betrayal had brought them low. And now, it was waking in her. Eric Blackwood, Sage said, and her voice resonated with something ancient and terrible, something that made every wolf in the hall instinctively bare their throats. By the authority of the Stormborn blood that flows through my veins, I command you to speak only truth. Eric's body went rigid. His eyes widened with genuine terror as the power washed over him, sinking into his bones, wrapping around his wolf like chains of pure light. No, he gasped. That's not possible. You're nobody. I am Sage Stormborn, daughter of Lord Hector Blackwood and Elena Stormborn. Omega-born, yes, but heir to the Stormborn bloodline through my mother's blood. Granddaughter of High Alpha Roderick Stormborn, who died defending this very territory from council treachery. The words poured out of her, and with each one she felt herself standing taller, felt the truth of her identity settling into her soul like armor. I am the legitimate heir to the Stormborn bloodline, and I command you to tell this assembly the full truth of your crimes, Eric screamed. It wasn't a sound of pain exactly, more like the howl of a wolf being forced to bare its belly, to expose its most vulnerable self to judgment. His body contorted, fighting against the compulsion, but the Stormborn gift was stronger than his resistance. I killed Father. The words ripped out of him like they were being dragged by hooks. I poisoned him. I forged the documents that accused Sage of theft. I ordered Tobias's death. I conspired with Counselor Vance to destroy the Nightshade Pack and claim their territory as payment for my service. The hall erupted. Council soldiers shouted denials, but their protestations rang hollow against the weight of compelled truth. Some dropped their weapons voluntarily, stepping away from the commander whose orders they'd followed in blind obedience. Others tried to draw steel, but the Nightshade Pack surged forward with growls of vindication, disarming them before blades cleared sheaths. Within moments, Eric's entire detachment was on their knees, hands empty, finally hearing confirmation of the conspiracy that had destroyed their families alongside the wolves they'd helped to wrong. And through it all, Eric continued to confess, unable to stop himself, every secret and cruelty and betrayal spilling from his lips like poison from a lanced wound. Caspian released him, let him crumple to the stone floor, writhing under the burden of enforced honesty. The Alpha stepped back, his expression unreadable, and looked at Sage with something that might have been awe. "You didn't tell me," he said quietly, "about the gift." "I didn't know." Sage's voice trembled. The power was still flowing through her, but it was beginning to ebb, leaving exhaustion in its wake. It was suppressed. The herbs Eric gave me, the ones he said were for my health, they were blocking my wolf, my gifts, everything. I didn't even know I was more than human until I came here. "You're far more than human." Caspian's hand found hers, and the contact sent warmth flooding through their bond. "You're extraordinary." Eric's confessions had finally stopped. He lay curled on the stone floor, shaking, his face wet with tears of rage and humiliation. When he looked up at Sage, there was no more contempt in his eyes, only fear. "What are you going to do to me?" he whispered. Sage walked toward him slowly. Each step felt momentous, weighted with the significance of this moment. For so long she had cowered before this man, had accepted his cruelty as her due, had believed, deep in her heart, that she deserved his contempt. No more. She stopped when she was close enough to see the pulse hammering in his throat, the sweat beading on his brow, close enough to smell his terror, sharp and acrid beneath the lingering traces of his expensive cologne. "Death would be a mercy," she said, and was surprised by how calm she sounded. "You'd be free of the shame, free of the knowledge that everything you did, every cruelty you inflicted, was for nothing. That the sister you despised turned out to be more powerful than you ever were." Eric flinched as if she'd struck him. "I could have you executed," Sage continued. "The evidence is overwhelming. Your confession was witnessed by everyone in this hall. No one would question my right to demand your life in payment for the lives you've taken." "Then do it." Eric's voice cracked. "Kill me and be done with it. That's what you want, isn't it? Revenge?" Sage considered him for a long moment. The brother who had tormented her, the man who had murdered the father she'd never really known, who had killed the gentle Omega who had loved her, who had tried to end her life, and the life of her child. "No," she said finally. "What I want is for you to live." Eric's eyes widened. "I want you to live as I lived," Sage said, and her voice was soft and terrible. "Stripped of everything. No pack. No name. No bloodline to claim. I want you to wander alone, knowing that everyone you meet will be able to scent the shame on you. I want you to spend every remaining day of your miserable existence knowing that the sister you called nothing was the one who destroyed you." She turned to Caspian, who was watching her with an expression of fierce pride. "Exile," she said, "without pack, without name. Let him live with what he's done." Caspian inclined his head in acknowledgement. "It will be done." "No." Eric lurched to his feet, but the Nightshade guards were already closing in, grabbing his arms, forcing him to his knees. "No, you can't do this. Kill me. Kill me, damn you. This is no mercy, this is—" "Living with what you've done is no mercy," Sage said quietly. "That's rather the point." They dragged him away. His screams echoed through the hall long after he'd disappeared from sight. Curses and threats and desperate pleas for a death that wouldn't come. Sage listened until the sounds faded entirely, and then she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. It was over. After 23 years of fear and hiding and pain, it was finally over. Her legs gave out. Caspian caught her before she could fall, sweeping her up into his arms as easily as if she weighed nothing at all. The bond between them pulsed with concern, with tenderness, with a fierce protectiveness that wrapped around her like a warm blanket. "I've got you," he murmured against her hair. "I've got you, little wolf." Sage buried her face in his chest and let herself cry. The tears came in great racking sobs that shook her entire body. She cried for Tobias, whose death she'd finally avenged. She cried for the father she'd never known, murdered by the son he'd trusted. She cried for the child she'd been, small and scared and so desperate to be loved. And she cried for the woman she was becoming, strong and powerful, and finally free. Caspian carried her through the halls of the manor, past watching eyes and whispered words of respect, up the stairs and into his chambers. Their chambers now, she realized dimly. He'd had her things moved here days ago, but she'd been too overwhelmed to fully process what that meant. He set her down on the bed, then knelt before her, his large hands gentle as they cupped her face. "You were magnificent," he said, and his voice was rough with emotion. "I've never seen anything like that. The gift, the way you—" He shook his head, seemingly at a loss for words. "You're a queen, Sage, a true queen. And I am so incredibly honored that you're mine." Sage laughed weakly, wiping at her wet cheeks. "I'm a mess. I'm pregnant and crying, and I probably look like a drowned rat. You look like the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." Caspian's thumb traced the curve of her cheekbone. "And you're not just pregnant, you're carrying my pup." Her heart stuttered. "Caspian, the baby isn't—" "This pup," he said firmly, placing his hand over the swell of her belly, "is mine. In every way that matters. I told you that, and I meant it. Love isn't about blood or rank, it's about choice. And I choose this child, just as I choose you." The words cracked something open inside her. Some last wall of defense, some final barrier she'd built around her heart to protect herself from hope. "I love you," she whispered, and the truth of it rang through their bond like a bell. "I know it's too fast. I know we barely know each other, but Caspian kissed her. It wasn't like their first kiss, desperate and claiming. This was tender, reverent. The kiss of a man who had found something precious and intended to cherish it for the rest of his life. When he pulled back, his golden eyes were burning. "I need to mark you," he said, and his voice had dropped into that low, growling register that made her entire body shiver. "I need to claim you properly, make you mine in a way that no one can ever question or deny, but only if you want it, only if you're ready." Sage's wolf stirred, rising up with an answering hunger that surprised her with its intensity. She'd spent so long with that part of herself suppressed, so long believing she was barely more than human. But the wolf had been there all along, waiting, and now it wanted its mate. "Yes," she breathed. "Please." Caspian's hands trembled as they moved to the buttons of her dress. He undressed her slowly, reverently, pressing kisses to each inch of skin he revealed. Sage's breath came faster as his lips traced across her collarbone, down the slope of her shoulder, lingering at the junction where her neck met her shoulder. "Here," he murmured against her pulse point. "This is where I'll mark you, where everyone will see that you belong to me." "And where will I mark you?" The question made him freeze. When he pulled back to look at her, there was something raw in his eyes, vulnerable. "You want to mark me?" "We're equals," Sage said quietly, reaching up to touch his face. "That's what you've been showing me since the moment you carried me in from the snow. You've never treated me like I was less than you. So yes, I want to mark you. I want the world to see that you belong to me just as much as I belong to you." Caspian made a sound low in his throat, something between a growl and a groan, and pulled her against him with a fierce intensity that stole her breath. "My perfect mate," he breathed. "My perfect, extraordinary mate." Their clothes fell away. Sage found herself pressed back against the pillows, Caspian's weight braced above her, his skin hot against hers. The bond between them was a living thing now, pulsing with desire and love and the ancient instinct that had drawn them together from the very beginning. "Ready?" he asked, and his voice was wrecked, barely human. Sage tilted her head, baring her throat in the most profound gesture of trust a wolf could offer. "Yes." Caspian's teeth found her neck. The pain was bright and sharp, a piercing sensation that made her gasp. But almost immediately it began to transform, heat spreading outward from the bite, pleasure blooming in its wake like flowers opening after rain. She felt his essence pouring into her through the wound, felt their bond deepening and widening until she couldn't tell where she ended and he began. She saw flashes of his memories. A young boy watching his pack burn, a man standing alone in the ashes. The moment he'd found her unconscious in the snow and felt his whole world rearrange itself around her. She felt his love for her, vast and deep and unwavering, felt his absolute certainty that she was everything he had ever needed. And through it all, she felt the bond settling into place, golden and warm and unbreakable. Caspian's teeth withdrew, his tongue laving gently over the wound to seal it. When he lifted his head to look at her, his eyes were pure molten gold, his wolf fully present and utterly devoted. "Mine," he growled. The word resonated through every fiber of her being. But they weren't finished. Sage pushed against his chest, and Caspian immediately rolled, letting her rise above him. His hands found her hips, steadying her, but he made no move to guide or control. This was her choice, her claiming. She looked down at him, this powerful alpha king who had knelt before her, who had defended her honor, who had loved her child before it was even born. She looked at the mark already forming on her shoulder, visible proof of his claim. And then she bent her head and bit. His skin parted beneath her teeth. Iron tang of blood flooding her mouth. She felt him shudder beneath her, heard his harsh groan of pleasure pain. And then she was drowning in him, his memories, his emotions, his absolute devotion pouring into her like a river finally finding the sea. She saw herself through his eyes, beautiful, fierce, incandescent with power she didn't yet fully understand. She felt his awe at her courage, his tenderness for her vulnerability, his savage protectiveness that would destroy anyone who tried to harm her. She felt how much he loved her, how completely, how devotedly, how irrevocably. "Yours," she whispered against his skin. "Mate," they said together. The bond completed with an almost audible click, settling into place between them like the final piece of a puzzle. Sage collapsed against his chest, and Caspian's arms came around her immediately, holding her with a gentleness that belied his strength. They lay there for a long time, breathing together, feeling the new bond pulse between them with every heartbeat. Sage could sense him now in ways she couldn't have imagined, not reading his thoughts exactly, but aware of his emotions, his presence, the essential truth of who he was. "I can feel you," she whispered, "inside me. It's like there's a part of you that lives in my heart now." "There is." Caspian pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "And a part of you lives in mine. That's what the bond is. That's what it means to be true mates." Sage lifted her head to look at him. In the dying light of the afternoon, the mark on his shoulder was already beginning to heal into a scar. Her mark, proof of her claim on him. She touched it gently, marveling at the sight. "No one's ever going to question who you belong to," she said. Caspian's smile was slow and satisfied. That was rather the point. The months that followed were a blur of activity. With Eric's confession witnessed by dozens and the letters providing documentary evidence, the council's conspiracy began to unravel. Councillor Vance was arrested. 3 other councillors fled before they could be brought to justice, but warrants were issued for their capture. Eric's soldiers were turned over to the Allied packs for judgment, Most were released after cooperating with the investigation, and a handful, shamed by what they'd been part of, asked to stay and serve Nightshade instead. The political landscape of the wolf packs was shifting, restructuring itself around the revelation that the Nightshade pack had been victims of deliberate destruction. And at the center of it all, acknowledged by all as the rightful Luna of Nightshade and the true heir to the Stormborn legacy, stood Sage. She found her place in the pack with surprising ease. The 12 survivors who had stood by Caspian through the darkest days welcomed her as one of their own, and as word spread of what had happened, of the truth she had revealed, the justice she had demanded, the mercy she had shown, others began to arrive. The council's public exposure had shattered the stigma overnight. Nightshade was no longer a cautionary tale, but a symbol of survival, the pack that had endured the worst the old guard could inflict and emerged with its honor intact. Wolves from packs that had suffered under council corruption sought them out. Refugees from the political upheaval. Lone wolves seeking a home. By the time the first snow of winter melted into spring, Nightshade had grown to over 100 members, and Sage had given birth to a daughter. The labor came on a night of heavy snow, the kind that muffled the world into silence. Aldrich guided the birth with steady hands while Caspian stayed at her side, his fingers laced through hers, his face pale with a terror that no battlefield had ever put there. Sage had been convinced that the universe would find some way to take this happiness from her, that the child would be still, or sickly, or that some final cruelty waited at the end of the journey she'd fought so hard to survive. Then the baby cried. The sound split the quiet of the room like a crack of dawn, furious and full-throated, and Sage felt the last of her fear dissolve in a rush of stunned, overwhelming love. She was perfect. Small and fierce and beautiful, with Tobias's dark curls and Sage's stubborn chin. Aldrich placed the baby on Sage's chest, and the tiny body went still against her skin, one miniature fist curling around a strand of Sage's hair. Caspian stood frozen beside the bed, tears streaming down his face, unable to speak. When Sage finally placed the baby in his arms, he held her like she was made of glass, and his voice broke on a single word: ours. Everything she had suffered, every blow, every humiliation, every night of cold and blood and terror had been worth it for this moment. They named her Elena, after Sage's mother. The Omega who had loved without regard for rank or consequence, who had defied convention to follow her heart, who had given Sage life and then protected her in the only way she could, by hiding her among the servants, keeping her safe from a world that would have destroyed her. Elena Nightshade, a new beginning built on the foundation of the past. On a warm evening in late summer, Sage stood on the balcony of the manor that had become her home, watching the sun set over the rebuilt village below. The sounds of the pack drifted up to her. Laughter and conversation, the happy shrieks of pups at play, the rhythm of a community that was healing. Arms wrapped around her from behind, and she leaned back into Caspian's solid warmth. Elena's finally asleep, he murmured against her hair. Kira's reading to her. I think we have at least an hour before she wakes up demanding to be fed again. Sage smiled, her hand drifting down to rest on her belly. It was barely rounded yet, too early to show, but she knew. She'd felt the change days ago, the subtle shift in her body that heralded new life. We should probably talk about that, she said. Caspian's arms tightened around her. Through the bond, she felt his sudden spike of hope, quickly tempered by caution. Talk about what? About how Elena's going to need a bigger room soon. Sage turned in his arms to look up at him, watching his face as understanding dawned. Because she's going to have to share the nursery with a sibling. For a long moment, Caspian just stared at her. Then a smile broke across his face like sunrise, brilliant and joyful and utterly unguarded. You're pregnant, he breathed. We're having a pup. We're having a pup. He lifted her off her feet, spinning her in a circle while she laughed and clutched at his shoulders. When he set her down, he kissed her thoroughly, and Sage felt his happiness flowing through the bond like warm honey. "I love you," he said against her lips. "My mate, my Luna, my queen. I love you too." Sage reached up to trace the scar on his shoulder, her mark on his skin. "My mate, my alpha, my king." Below them, in the village that had risen from ashes, a wolf began to howl. Others joined in, a chorus of voices raised in celebration of life and love and the unbreakable bonds that held them together. The sound rose up into the evening sky, carrying with it all the hope and promise of a pack rebuilt, a family forged, a future reclaimed. Sage added her voice to the song and felt her wolf howling with pure, incandescent joy. She was no longer the broken servant girl cowering in corners, invisible and afraid. She was Luna of Nightshade, heir to the Stormborn legacy, mate to the Alpha King who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself. She was exactly where she was meant to be. And as the howling faded into contented silence, as Caspian's hand found hers and their bond hummed with quiet happiness, Sage looked out over her pack and her home and her life and smiled. Finally, after everything, she was home.